When Prince Harry finally spoke up, the response in Britain was one of shock and incredulity. After years of unwavering devotion, he talked with an unpredictable candor that suggested regret, alienation, and a long-buried truth. Some perceive tiredness, some hear subtle resentment, and a few sense intentional timing. Faces allegedly froze, phones lit up, and palace watchers went silent. Why did Harry choose this moment to speak now? Because his last statement implies that all we believed to be true was merely the tip of the iceberg. When allegiance was not as powerful as silence. For the first time in years, Prince Harry walked into the public glare and accomplished something no one in Britain expected. He spoke without grabbing for Meghan's name as a shield. There was no familiar praise, no delicate reminder of how misunderstood she had been, no soft framing aimed to steer listeners towards sympathy. The moment seemed stark, almost disturbing, because the absence was clear. Where there had always been a united front, a shared language of we and us, there was now simply Harry standing alone in his remarks. The UK was shocked by something other than what he stated. It was what he purposefully left out. Listeners leaned in, waiting for the usual defense to arrive, for the tone to turn toward protection or explanation. It never did. His tone remained cool, collected, and remarkably impartial. Gone was the urgency that formerly tinted every mention of his wife. Gone was the instinct to characterize every issue as a misunderstanding or an attack from the outside. Instead, his stillness created a vacuum, and that silence suddenly became the loudest statement he had ever uttered. The British media immediately noticed the change. Commentators reviewed the footage, not to criticize his wording, but to examine the pauses, the deliberate selections, the lines he refused to cross. For years, Harry had been predictable in one aspect. No matter the question, he would always loop back to Meghan, framing her as central, vulnerable, and victimized. This time, there was no circling back. The distance felt intentional, even strategic. It suggested that this wasn't a man striving to explain himself, but someone silently redrawing limits. What made the moment so stunning was how restrained it was. There was no rage, no accusation, no dramatic unveiling. That restraint required audiences to read between the lines. Harry's refusal to defend himself was a powerful statement in a media society accustomed to impassioned monologues and shattering admissions. It hinted at a shift not just in tone, but in allegiance. The silence signaled separation, not of marriage necessarily, but of tales. Harry was no longer carrying the narrative of another person with him for the first time. Across the UK, sentiments ranged from astonishment to disbelief. Headlines didn't scream scandal. They doubted the significance. Analysts questioned why this way and why now. Royal observers observed how rare it was for Harry to speak publicly without identifying himself directly with Meghan's position. That alignment had once been automatic, almost instinctual. Its absence generated awkward questions. Has something changed behind closed doors? Was this a gentle adjustment, a discreet rejection to keep playing a part he had long accepted without challenge? What developed was a new tone totally. Harry wasn't trying to defend past choices or rewrite history. He wasn't asking for understanding. He was just stopping to clarify. And in a world where he had spent years over-explaining, that decision felt purposeful and genuinely significant. The silence didn't feel like hesitancy. It felt like resolution. It signaled the start of a new type of dialogue, one in which distance took the place of defense and the narrative was now controlled by what Harry ultimately decided to keep silent rather than what he stated out loud. What would happen, then, if Harry stopped explaining completely? Was it a quiet capitulation or the start of something much riskier? Keep watching. The moment the plot tilted. If the first shift was sensed in what Prince Harry refrained to say, the second arrived in how carefully he chose his words. This was the point where the atmosphere altered, where listeners throughout the UK understood that something deeper was emerging behind the placid surface of his remarks. As Harry spoke about the past, he didn't deny the decisions that had affected his life. He didn't put the move overseas, the high-profile interviews, or the traumatic breakup with his family behind him. Instead, he acknowledged them openly, almost clinically. But the way he framed those choices marked a stark shift from everything that had come before. Harry spoke as someone exploring a route he previously believed was solid. He clarified that, at the time, he acted based on his understanding of reality. There was a modest but noticeable accent. These were not the statements of a guy manipulating history to escape blame. They were the remarks of a person reviewing the data that led him. With each line, he switched the attention away from emotion and toward context, allowing listeners to ponder not only what happened, but why he believed those actions were important in the first place. As he traveled over old territory, media appearances that provoked indignation, decisions that reinforced family divisions, there was no defensiveness in his tone. Instead, there was a modest recalibration. He spoke as though he were setting pieces on a table, not to accuse, but to show how the picture had been built. The inference hovered in the air. If the foundation was defective, then everything placed on top of it deserved to be questioned. The UK became more aware of this. Commentators didn't hear bitterness or anger. They heard uncertainty measured and deliberate. Harry stated that some of the storylines he once repeated so firmly were not born from his own instincts or experiences. They were stories he embraced, trusted, and carried forth as truth. The theory was uncomfortable because it reframed years of public strife. If those stories weren't wholly his, the notion that Harry was the only one who caused disruption started to fall apart. What made this moment so remarkable was its restraint. Harry did not give names. He made no accusations. He didn't even identify himself as duped. He merely accepted that belief and reality don't always correspond, especially when judgments are made under duress. That revelation alone was enough to fuel conjecture. Was he claiming he had been guided purposefully or not along a route he might not have chosen with complete knowledge? Across Britain, the question circulated swiftly. Analysts repeated his statements, dissecting their meaning, weighing their repercussions. The debate turned from judgment to inquiry. Had Harry been operating on inadequate truths? Had the story the public accepted for years been formed on assumptions that were never really his own? His statement's transparency was what gave it its impact. By reframing responsibility without rejecting it, Harry welcomed criticism not of his acts, but of the system behind them. As this awareness settled in, it became evident that this was not an attempt to attack or assign blame. It was a more unstable thing. By showing the instability of the narrative space, Harry wasn't tearing anything down outright. He was letting the audience to see the flaws for themselves, laying the stage for questions that would not be so easily contained if the discourse continued forward. As Harry let stillness disclose the fissures, was this reality always hidden from him or carefully kept out of reach? Pay attention. The truth he was never given. As the weight of Prince Harry's reframed reflections sank, a more frightening layer began to appear. One that made omission the main focus instead of miscommunication. This was where the narrative took a sharper turn. Not through accusation, but through disclosure. Harry came to accept that some of the most explosive disputes that defined his public life were shaped in rooms he was never in, through talks he never heard, and decisions he never completely understood at the time they were unfolding. Meghan Markle portrayed herself in public for years as calm, patient, and reactive rather than combative. In interviews and carefully orchestrated appearances, she appeared as the calm center of a tempest caused by others, by the press, by palace tradition, by foreign antagonism. Harry believed that image totally. He stood next to her, certain that he was standing up for someone who had been unfairly singled out. But sources now argue that behind that serene public posture, Meghan was significantly more engaged in fostering the very turmoil she claimed to undergo. According to sources close to the matter, Harry only lately became aware of how much communication had been going without his direct involvement. Communications, debates, and strategic exchanges apparently took place while he stayed concentrated elsewhere, confident that he was being kept fully informed. He wasn't. His closest friends and family claimed that this insight didn't come to him suddenly. But gradually, through little anomalies, delayed disclosures, and occasions where outcomes didn't fit with what he thought had been agreed upon, the image that began to build was extremely unsettling. Meghan, sources indicate, often positioned herself as the recipient of pressure while discreetly manipulating how things evolved. She appeared publicly as the one under attack. Yet behind the scenes, she was molding responses, steering storylines, and enabling tensions to grow. Harry, meantime, responded to the visible results. Media backlash, royal silence, public fury without seeing the whole chain of events that led there. This reframing casts his extended quiet in a fresh light. What was formerly thought to be everlasting commitment now seems more like involuntary involvement. Harry wasn't remaining quiet to protect Meghan from criticism. He was functioning with incomplete information. He defended positions he thought were common. Repeated justifications that he felt were reciprocal, and took responsibility for results he wasn't entirely responsible for. The fights he fought against the press, against the palace, against public opinion were not necessarily prompted by his own convictions. As this realization took hold, it allegedly shocked him greatly. Friends describe a man struggling with the delayed awareness that his involvement had been reactive rather than directing, rather than betrayal in the dramatic sense. Unaware of who had struck the initial match, he had been reacting to fires that were already on. That awareness didn't make him angry so much as uneasy. It made him reevaluate the whole system of trust that informed his decisions, not just specific instances. The ramifications were severe. If Harry had been protected from essential details, then years of public struggle had played out on a distorted field. Meghan's portrayal as a passive target began to look more nuanced, even intentional, while Harry's quiet, previously praised as devotion, came to resemble something far more unsettling. He was silent because he didn't know what he was really protecting. As these pieces came together, it became evident that this reckoning was only getting started, and that the distance he was now establishing was due to the gradual breakdown of the surety he had previously depended upon without question rather than rejection. So when Britain was placed as enemy, was Harry defending love or guarding a truth he was never allowed to see? Keep riveted. When Britain was cast as the enemy. As Prince Harry's reappraisal intensified, the focus moved beyond personal mistakes and into something far more troubling. The assumption that the backlash against the UK was an inevitable result of institutional rigidity and cultural friction was challenged by this moment, which was what really shocked Britain. Harry's remarks implied something else entirely. He argued that the enmity leveled against Britain didn't simply happen. It grew, was strengthened, and in important moments was quietly promoted. Rather than portraying the public fury as a natural confrontation between modern principles and old traditions, Harry talked in a way that hinted at intention. He did not blame the nation directly. Nor did he retreat into nostalgia. Instead, he called attention to how fast Britain became the convenient villain in a much wider drama. Every critique, every headline, every wave of fury appeared to land in the same place. The UK was seen as icy, antagonistic, and unyielding, while blame for the worsening conflict shifted elsewhere, unidentified and untouched. What unsettled British audiences was the implication that this narrative served someone considerably more than it served the truth. Harry implied that focusing displeasure against Britain produced leverage. It reduced complicated circumstances to a single, palatable foe. In such framing, nuance disappeared. Individual voices were muffled, and the nation as a whole became a symbol, taking on the responsibility that might have been more properly examined. Many viewers experienced a sudden epiphany, realizing that this was about perception control rather than merely cultural misunderstanding. The idea that public sentiment could be swayed so skillfully was very unpleasant. Britain prides itself on debate, skepticism, and a free press. Yet, here was a sign that trust itself had been twisted. The monarchy, typically portrayed as the principal target of criticism, was no longer the only sufferer. Ordinary people, institutions, and even long-standing relationships between the public and the royal family were brought into a tempest that may have been exacerbated for strategic effect. Although Harry's tone was composed, the implications were explosive. He appeared to concede that everything else was simpler to defend after Britain was established as the adversary. Decisions appeared necessary rather than voluntary. Broken links felt inevitable rather than intentional. A single narrative that lived on separation and offered little opportunity for introspection or doubt was justified more and more by the growing intensity of the backlash. For UK audiences, this reframing was unsettling. Many had fought, defended, critiqued, and contested what they saw as a natural breakdown between a nation and a partnership. Now they were being asked to assess whether that breakdown had been shaped, guided, and at times purposefully fueled. It wasn't simply about culture or tradition. It was about how stories become powerful when they provide clarity, even if that clarity compromises the truth. Ignoring the cost got more difficult as this awareness set in. Public trust had been stretched thin, used as a tool rather than respected as a foundation. No longer was Britain merely responding. It was identifying itself as part of a story that may have been carefully crafted. And once that possibility entered the conversation, the certainties that had surrounded the past began to crumble, leaving behind a far more complicated and troubling picture that refused to stay neatly contained. Now, as Britain looked deeper, did it realize trust was surrendered for narrative control? And who was the real winner? Stay with us. It was hard to ignore the trend once controversy turned into money. Every high-profile dispute, every whispered scandal appeared to emerge with magical timing, frequently coinciding with key business actions or media efforts. The pandemonium itself seemed to have a rhythm and a schedule that were determined by calculation rather than by chance. Sources close to Harry highlighted a frustrating situation behind the scenes. Resistance from him often exists. He questioned the timing, the optics, the collateral damage. But his reservations were routinely trumped by an aggressive push to control the narrative. The stakes were quite high in these situations, and brand strategy took precedence over personal feelings. From the outside, it might have appeared like a collection of regrettable episodes, as though the public errors were the natural fallout of a highly visible life. Yet, insiders describe a different picture, one where Meghan's influence and strategic intuition played a significant part in orchestrating visibility. Controversy wasn't only tolerated. It was used. In a bigger game where attention translated into opportunity, pain, humiliation, and public backlash were viewed as instruments in money. The United Kingdom, in particular, interpreted these events through a prism of controlled escalation, viewing them less as human drama and more as a premeditated series of acts in a meticulously produced performance. One former helper described it as a continual push-pull. At the prospect of headlines portraying him in a hostile manner, Harry would become agitated at the thought of making statements right after personal attacks. Yet the momentum from Meghan's side, driven by timing and an almost surgical awareness of exposing, often prevailed. Campaigns would come after disputes. Carefully timed interviews, charitable announcements, and media appearances were utilized to recast the narrative, transforming what could have been solely negative events into opportunities for visibility, influence, and ultimately power. Though modest, the pattern was clearly visible. Observers remarked that the plan wasn't only about personal branding. It was about establishing leverage. Each wave of unfavorable publicity, each heated social media moment created possibilities to reset talks on their own terms. What outsiders regarded as stumbles or failures were in many cases prelude to calculated returns, a high-profile announcement, a book deal, a humanitarian drive aimed to recover the spotlight. Insiders understood the message. Pain was not incidental. It was an investment, a necessary outlay of funds for a bigger, more profitable reward. In this setting, Harry's hesitations were portrayed as caution. Meghan's need to make a decision. Every action was watched closely. Each response was evaluated based on how much attention it could draw. And as the world discussed the human implications, the players behind the scenes knew that each moment of public discomfort contained hidden value, shaping public opinion, sustaining relevance, and guaranteeing that no matter the impact, the brand always came first. So how did Harry go from being a partner to a product when his brand was based solely on calculated discomfort and every hesitation fueled it? When Harry became the target, it wasn't a single instant of realization. It was a creeping, obvious pattern that descended over Harry with crushing weight. Time and again, blame seemed to find him. Regardless of the situation, he was the prince who was scrutinized and blamed for mistakes. The exile depicted as both victim and villain. Each scandal, each meticulously timed storm of public attention landed directly on his shoulders. Those closest to him began to notice the beat. While Harry absorbed the criticism, Meghan remained undamaged, calm, composed, seemingly undisturbed by consequence. Her remoteness was stunning, her posture unshaken, and the contrast only intensified the sense of injustice he felt. Friends and helpers characterized it as a terrible revelation. In private chats, Harry began to follow the threads of each scandal. Each media misstep and saw the pattern forming with terrible clarity. When headlines attacked, when public opinion turned caustic, he suffered the brunt. She moved freely when opportunities presented themselves and when narratives needed to be guided, influencing results covertly. Her quiet functioning as a shield. Sympathy, which had originally been scattered, began to coalesce strongly toward him as observers noticed the obvious disparity in accountability. The more the world condemned him, the more she seemed to gain authority, quietly handling the aftermath to her benefit. This relationship was not just unfair. It was alienating. Harry, accustomed to duty and scrutiny as part of a royal life, found himself alone in the storm, while Meghan's deliberate serenity allowed her to dodge the aftermath. Harry's every reaction, every word, every attempt to defend himself became grist for greater attack. Long nights of introspection, a feeling of betrayal, and the quiet, knowing realization that his place in this meticulously staged story was always predestined were all reported by those who knew him. He was unwillingly the public face of dispute, the one expected to absorb judgment, while others maneuvered unscathed behind the scenes. The emotional weight of the realization added to its penetrating quality. In addition to dealing with outside pressures, Harry also had to deal with the psychological effects of witnessing his spouse be aloof in a chaotic situation that he was unable to completely control or avoid. Each blunder attributed to him, each hint of guilt carried the sting of injustice. It was in these moments that the story of sympathy transformed. Observers and insiders alike began to perceive Harry not just as a player in controversy, but as the one continually sacrificed for another's gain. His suffering had ceased to be collateral. It was the very money of power silently transacted beneath a facade of composure that sheltered Meghan from damage. As the pattern became clear, Harry's worldview evolved. What had formerly been a collaborative trip now appeared choreographed, and his role apparent. He was the one to fall, to take the blame, to face the public eye's toughest scrutiny. She stayed unharmed, her quiet both protective and potent, while he faced the burden of repercussions that were never his alone. Understanding this caused the narrative to shift and the story of sympathy to tilt significantly, highlighting the public and personal cost he suffered while the strategies subtly advanced on the opposite side. But how did Harry know that he was the only one responsible? And what happens when the quiet architect gets exposed? The moment Harry couldn't stay concealed. For years, the weight of public scrutiny had crushed on Harry, influencing his every action, every appearance, every word. As he watched the person closest to him navigate controversy unscathed, her quiet serving as both a shield and a tactic, he had to put up with accusations, criticism, and judgment. Yet, the last trigger, the moment that pushed him to speak, did not come from outside, from the UK, the palace, or the press. It came from within. The devastating awareness of how much had been concealed from him, how long the truth had been kept just out his grasp. He wasn't broken by anger at the media or dissatisfaction with royal procedure. It was the awareness that he had been permitted, possibly even guided, to act as a shield, suffering the fallout while others were spared. According to others close to him, as the layers came off, he felt increasingly betrayed. Harry's reflections revealed a life spent in partial shadows, a narrative carefully controlled in which he had been the major performer but not the author. Each revelation reinforced his knowledge of the imbalance, revealing that his silence had unknowingly backed a system that had long exploited it. The realization was unpleasant. He was not merely the public face of dispute, but the vehicle through which influence was maintained. The empathy that had gathered around him in earlier stages of his life now became more intense. The picture that emerged was stark. He had been used and the expense had been nearly entirely his own. He did not talk to punish or vilify. There was no thirst for vengeance. Rather, he spoke in order to restore agency and to distinguish between one's own truth and the story of the public. Speaking was not about reconciliation. It was about separation. The purposeful contrast between what he had undergone and the truth others had insulated themselves from. Every interview, every speech, every public revelation was a proclamation of autonomy. It was a declaration that his viewpoint, his suffering, and his experiences could no longer be appropriated or used to absolve someone else of responsibility. Those around him observed a shift. The careful restraint of the past gave way to a controlled, deliberate candor, a determination to continue taking consequences in quiet. Friends and insiders noticed that there is a chilling clarity to Harry's new attitude. It wasn't a reactionary decision to speak now. It was strategic. The product of years of reflection and silent observation. He recognized the stakes, the public gaze, and the potential blowback. Yet the desire to express his truth transcended any fear of repercussions. Each disclosure, each narrative recounted was meant not to inflame but to illuminate, to establish boundaries and assure that his voice was no longer stifled, diverted, or co-opted. The implications were apparent. It would no longer be a common story, but more would follow. They were gone, along with the well-planned public appearances, cooperative media appearances, and a sense of unity. What was left was clarity, a statement that he would no longer act as a shield going forward and that his truth was his own. For onlookers, this was the pivotal moment. What had once been private frustration had become a public reckoning, a statement of independence and an unwillingness to face responsibilities for the sake of another. In understanding why he spoke, the story moves from blame to revelation, from suffering to agency. It was not vengeance, nor rage, nor an attempt to alter history. It was, above all, a reclamation of self, a conscious separation of tales that had long been linked, and a warning that the era of silence had over. Harry's voice, previously muffled by circumstance and loyalty, now carried with deliberate weight, signifying that the next chapter, whatever form it might take, would be his alone. So, what do you believe finally caused Harry to break his silence? Was it concealed realities, silent regret, or a boundary he wouldn't cross? Does this impact how you see everything? We'd like to hear your ideas in the comments. Remember to subscribe, share, and like.